Sarah Martinez stood at the back of the crowded veterans meeting hall, her hands trembling slightly as she watched dozens of uniformed men and women share their stories. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes that had become permanent fixtures over the past 3 years. She had come here hoping to find some sense of belonging, some connection to others who might understand the weight she carried every day. The meeting was for veterans struggling with PTSD and adjustment issues. Sarah had read about it online, and, after weeks of internal debate, she had finally worked up the courage to attend. She wore a simple black hoodie and jeans, nothing that would draw attention to herself. That was how she preferred it these days, invisible, unnoticed, forgotten. As the moderator called for new attendees to introduce themselves, Sarah's heart began racing. Several people had already shared their military experiences, tours in Afghanistan, deployments to Iraq, struggles with coming home. When all eyes turned to her, she felt the familiar surge of panic that had become her constant companion. "I'm Sarah," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "I served in the Navy." It wasn't technically a lie, though it wasn't the complete truth either. The details of her service were classified, buried under layers of government paperwork that officially didn't exist. As far as most records were concerned, Sarah Martinez had been a logistics coordinator stationed at various bases during her 8-year career. The truth was far more complicated. After the meeting, Sarah found herself walking alongside Marcus Thompson, a Marine veteran who had introduced himself as someone who had served 3 tours overseas. He was friendly and talkative, and Sarah found his easy conversation a welcome distraction from her usual isolation. "You seem pretty quiet about your service," Marcus observed as they stepped out into the cool evening air. "I get it though. Some things are hard to talk about." Sarah nodded, unsure how to respond. Marcus had shared stories about convoy operations and firefights with insurgents. Her own experiences were nothing she could ever share, nothing that officially existed. "What unit were you with?" Marcus asked casually as they walked toward the parking lot. The question sent a chill down Sarah's spine. It was innocent enough, but it was exactly the kind of question that always made her freeze up. Her actual unit designation was classified. Her real military occupational specialty was something that couldn't appear on any public record. Even her deployment locations were officially redacted from her service record. "Special operations," she said finally, the words coming out more as a whisper than a statement. Marcus stopped walking and turned to look at her with new interest. "Really? What kind of special ops?" Sarah's mouth went dry. She had said too much already, but something about Marcus's genuine interest and the isolation she had been feeling made her want to continue the conversation, even though every instinct told her to walk away. "SEAL teams," she heard herself saying, and immediately regretted it. The lie hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt sick to her stomach. It wasn't entirely a lie. She had worked with SEAL teams, had been embedded with them on multiple occasions, had earned their respect through actions she could never discuss. But she had never been a SEAL herself, and claiming that she was felt like a betrayal of both her actual service and the men who had served in those elite units. Marcus's eyebrows shot up. "No kidding? I had no idea women could serve as SEALs." "It's complicated," Sarah said, wishing she could take back the words. "The programs are different now than they used to be." Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself drawn back to the veterans' meetings. Marcus had introduced her to several other people, and word had spread about her supposed SEAL background. She found herself caught in a web of her own making, unable to correct the misunderstanding without revealing the truth about her classified service. The attention was both welcome and terrifying. For the first time in years, people looked at her with respect and interest rather than the mixture of pity and concern she had grown accustomed to from friends and family who didn't understand why she struggled so much with civilian life. These veterans understood nightmares and hypervigilance and the way certain sounds could transport you back to a battlefield in an instant. But the lie grew heavier with each passing day. Sarah found herself researching SEAL training and operations online, trying to learn enough details to maintain the fiction she had created. She studied the locations of BUD/S training, memorized the names of famous SEAL operations, and absorbed everything she could about the culture and traditions of the teams. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was learning more about the SEALs as a civilian than she had ever known during her actual classified service, when operational security had kept her compartmented from most details about the units she supported. As weeks turned into months, Sarah's deception became more elaborate. She spoke vaguely about training exercises and deployments, always keeping details sparse and claiming that much of her service was still classified. The other veterans respected the classification excuse and didn't push for details, which only made Sarah feel worse about lying to people who had shown her such genuine friendship and support. The weight of the deception began taking its toll. Sarah's sleep, already disrupted by nightmares related to her actual service, became even more disturbed. She would lie awake replaying conversations, analyzing every word she had said for potential inconsistencies. The hypervigilance that had been a survival mechanism during her real military service now turned inward, making her constantly paranoid that someone would discover her lie. One evening after a particularly difficult group session where several veterans had shared traumatic memories from their deployments, Sarah found herself sitting alone in her car in the parking lot, crying uncontrollably. The stories the others had shared reminded her of her own experiences, the missions she could never discuss, the teammates she had lost, the operations that officially never happened. Marcus knocked on her car window, concern written across his face. "Hey, you okay in there?" Sarah rolled down the window, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Yeah, just tough night, you know?" "I get it," Marcus said gently. "Some of those stories hit close to home. Want to talk about it?" The genuine compassion in his voice made Sarah's guilt even worse. Marcus had become a real friend, someone who checked on her regularly and included her in social activities with other veterans. He had no idea that their friendship was built on a foundation of lies. "Sometimes I feel like a fraud," Sarah said, which was perhaps the most honest thing she had said in months. "We all feel that way sometimes," Marcus replied. "Survivor's guilt is real. Just because you made it home doesn't mean you don't belong here with the rest of us." His words were meant to be comforting, but they only made Sarah feel worse. He thought she was struggling with survivor's guilt from SEAL operations she had never participated in, when her actual survivor's guilt came from classified missions she could never acknowledge. As Sarah drove home that night, she made a decision. She would find a way to gradually distance herself from the veterans group before her lies were discovered. She would claim work obligations or family issues, slowly fade away from their lives before anyone got hurt. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. The next week, the veterans group was invited to participate in a community event honoring military service members. It was meant to be a celebration, with local officials and military representatives in attendance. Sarah tried to decline, claiming she wasn't comfortable with public events, but Marcus and the others insisted she come. "You've been hiding too long," Marcus told her. "It's time to let people know about the sacrifices you've made." The event was held at a local convention center, with displays from different military branches and organizations. Sarah felt increasingly uncomfortable as she walked through the crowds of uniformed personnel and military families. Several people thanked her for her service when Marcus introduced her as a former SEAL, and each expression of gratitude felt like another weight added to her already heavy conscience. She was standing near a display about Special Operations Forces when she overheard two men in Navy dress uniforms talking quietly. "I'm telling you, something's not right about her story," one of them was saying. "I've been with the teams for 15 years, and I've never heard of any female SEALs during the timeframe she's claiming." "Maybe it was some kind of pilot program," the other man replied. "You know how compartmented some of that stuff is." "Maybe, but I doubt it." "And did you see that tattoo on her wrist? It looked familiar, but I can't place it." Sarah's blood ran cold. She had been careful to keep her sleeves down most of the time, but during a moment of nervousness earlier, she had pushed up her sleeve and briefly exposed the small tattoo on her inner wrist. It was a simple design, a trident surrounded by 13 stars, but it wasn't a Navy SEAL tattoo. It was something else entirely, something that connected to her real service in ways that could never be publicly acknowledged. She tried to move away from the conversation, but the two Navy officers had noticed her proximity and were now looking at her with obvious suspicion. "Excuse me, miss," the older of the two officers called out. "Could we have a word with you?" Sarah's heart began pounding as she turned to face them. Both men wore the insignia of senior enlisted personnel, and their bearing suggested extensive experience in special operations communities. "I'm Senior Chief Petty Officer Davidson," the older man said, extending his hand. "This is Petty Officer First Class Roberts. We understand you served with the SEAL teams?" "Yes," Sarah managed to say, her voice sounding weak to her own ears. "That's interesting," Davidson continued, his tone professionally neutral but his eyes sharp and assessing. Because I've been with NSW for my entire career, and I don't recall any female SEALs during the time frame when you would have served.
Could you tell us which team you were assigned to?
The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah knew she was caught, knew that these men had the knowledge and experience to see through any story she might try to construct. Her mind raced through possible responses, but every option seemed to lead to deeper deception or immediate exposure. She began, then stopped, unable to continue the lie when faced with people who would know the truth.
Ma'am, Roberts said quietly, stolen valor is a serious offense. If you've been misrepresenting your military service, it's better to come clean now rather than have this escalate.
The phrase stolen valor hit Sarah like a physical blow.
That was exactly what she had been doing, wasn't it? Claiming credit for service she hadn't performed, accepting gratitude and respect she hadn't earned.
The fact that her actual service had been equally dangerous and demanding didn't change the fundamental dishonesty of her claims.
I never meant.
She started to say, but her voice trailed off as she saw Marcus approaching with several other veterans from their group. Sarah, there you are, Marcus said cheerfully, then noticed the tense atmosphere.
Everything okay here?
Davidson and Roberts exchanged glances, and Sarah could see them making a decision about how to handle the situation. We were just discussing military service with your friend here, Davidson said carefully.
There seemed to be some questions about her background. Marcus looked confused, then defensive. Sarah's a SEAL. She's one of the toughest people I know. Is that so?
Roberts asked, looking directly at Sarah. Because we have some concerns about the validity of those claims. The small group that had gathered began to attract attention from other people at the event. Sarah could see curious faces turning in their direction, and she knew that within minutes, what had started as a quiet confrontation would become a very public embarrassment.
Look, she said desperately, there's been a misunderstanding. I never said I was a SEAL exactly.
I said I worked with special operations. That's not how I remember it, Marcus said, looking hurt and confused.
You specifically told me you were with the SEAL teams. Davidson nodded grimly. Ma'am, I think you need to come with us. We need to sort this out properly.
As more people began to notice the commotion, Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. The lie that had started as a moment of weakness had grown into something that was about to destroy not only her reputation but also the friendships she had built with people who had shown her nothing but kindness and acceptance. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, Marcus's confusion and hurt, Davidson's stern professionalism, Robert's obvious anger, and the growing crowd of curious onlookers. In that moment, Sarah realized that no matter how this situation resolved, her life as she had been trying to rebuild it was about to come crashing down around her. The convention center suddenly felt impossibly large and impossibly small at the same time. Sarah was trapped in a nightmare of her own making, and she could see no way out that wouldn't result in complete humiliation and the loss of everything she had been trying to build since leaving the military. As Davidson reached for her arm to escort her away from the crowd, Sarah closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for whatever was about to come. She had survived classified missions behind enemy lines, had faced death more times than she could count, but nothing had prepared her for this moment of absolute vulnerability and exposure.
The irony was overwhelming.
Her real military service had been exemplary, had involved genuine heroism and sacrifice that would never be publicly acknowledged. But it was her fake claims about service she had never performed that were about to destroy her life. As she opened her eyes and prepared to face the consequences of her deception, Sarah caught sight of another face in the crowd, an older man in a navy dress uniform with Admiral stripes on his sleeves. He was watching the scene unfold with an expression she couldn't quite read, and something about his presence made her feel even more exposed and vulnerable. The Admiral's eyes met hers across the crowd, and, for a moment, time seemed suspended. Then, Davidson's hand closed around her arm, and the moment shattered as she was led away from the crowd toward what she assumed would be an interrogation that would expose her lies and destroy what little remained of her dignity. Sarah found herself in a small conference room adjacent to the main event hall, sitting across from Senior Chief Davidson and Petty Officer Roberts. The room was sterile and fluorescent lit, with motivational Navy posters on the walls that seemed to mock her current situation. Through the thin walls, she could hear the muffled sounds of the continuing celebration, a stark contrast to the tension filling the small space. Davidson had his phone out and was making calls to verify information, while Robert sat with his arms crossed, clearly frustrated by what he saw as a clear case of stolen valor. Sarah sat in silence, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to figure out how to explain herself without revealing classified information that could land her in even more serious trouble. Okay, let's start from the beginning, Davidson said, putting his phone down and opening a small notebook.
Full name, rank, and service dates.
Sarah Elena Martinez, she said quietly. Petty Officer First Class.
I served from 2014 to 2022.
Roberts was already shaking his head. There were no female SEALs during that period. The first women didn't even begin SEAL training until 2021, and none have graduated yet. Sarah closed her eyes, knowing that she was about to walk into a minefield.
I never said I graduated from BUD/S.
I said I worked with SEAL teams.
In what capacity?
Davidson asked, his pen poised over his notebook. This was the impossible question.
Sarah's actual role had been with a classified Naval Special Warfare Development Group unit that officially didn't exist.
She had been part of a small team of specialists who provided technical support and intelligence analysis for high-priority missions. Her security clearance had been higher than most of the SEALs she worked with, and her contributions had been vital to mission success on multiple occasions. But none of that could ever be acknowledged publicly. Her service record had been sanitized, her actual assignments buried under cover stories about logistics and administration. Even her DD-214 discharge papers listed her final assignment as Naval Support Activity, a deliberately vague designation that revealed nothing about her real work. Intelligence support, she said finally, which was at least partially true.
What kind of intelligence support?
Roberts pressed.
What was your MOS? Sarah's actual military occupational specialty was so classified that it didn't appear in standard Navy personnel manuals.
Her official MOS was listed as Logistics Specialist, a cover that had allowed her to deploy with Special Operations units without drawing attention to her real function.
LS, she said, using the abbreviated form for Logistics Specialist.
Davidson and Roberts exchanged glances. It was clear they weren't buying her story. Look, Roberts said, leaning forward, logistics specialists don't deploy with SEAL teams on combat operations.
You're not making any sense.
Sarah felt trapped. Everything she said seemed to make things worse, but she couldn't reveal the truth without potentially violating national security laws that could result in prison time.
I can't discuss the details, she said. Most of my service is still classified. That's convenient, Roberts muttered.
Davidson held up a hand to quiet his colleague.
Ma'am, I understand that some military service involves classified information.
But claiming to be a SEAL when you weren't is a serious matter. We've had guys die earning that trident, and when people fake that service, it dishonors their memory. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She thought about the SEALs she had worked with over the years, many of whom had become friends despite the barriers that classification created. She thought about Petty Officer Rodriguez, who had been killed in Somalia during a mission she had helped plan. She thought about Chief Watson, who had lost his leg in Afghanistan while protecting an asset she had been assigned to extract. These were men whose sacrifice and heroism she respected deeply, and the idea that she was dishonoring their memory made her physically sick. I would never dishonor their service, she said, tears starting to form in her eyes.
I know what they sacrificed. I was there. Where exactly were you? Davidson asked. What missions? What teams? Each question was another trap. Sarah couldn't name specific missions without revealing classified information. She couldn't name the teams because her unit designation was itself classified. She couldn't provide the details that would prove her service was real and important because doing so would violate the oath of secrecy she had taken when she received her security clearance. I can't. She began, then stopped. There was no way to win this conversation. The door to the conference room opened, and Marcus stepped in, looking worried and confused. Sarah, what's going on?
Everyone's talking about how you lied about being a SEAL. The hurt in his voice was worse than any accusation from the Navy personnel. Marcus had become a genuine friend, someone who had helped her through some of her darkest moments since leaving the military. The idea that he now saw her as a liar and a fraud was almost unbearable. Marcus, it's complicated, she said.
I never meant to mislead anyone.
But you did lie, didn't you? He said.
You told me you were a SEAL.
Sarah looked at the floor, unable to meet his eyes. Yes, I lied about that.
Jesus, Sarah. Do you have any idea what this means?
Half the guys in our group are talking about reporting you for stolen valor.
They're saying you've been faking PTSD to get sympathy.
That accusation cut deeper than any of the others.
Sarah's PTSD was very real, the result of missions that had left her with nightmares and hypervigilance that made normal life a constant struggle.
The idea that people thought she was faking her psychological wounds for attention was devastating.
I'm not faking anything, she said quietly. My service was real. It was just different from what I said. How are we supposed to believe anything you say now? Marcus asked.
Before Sarah could respond, the door opened again, and she looked up to see the Admiral she had noticed earlier stepping into the room. He was older, probably in his 60s, with gray hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades in positions of significant responsibility. His uniform displayed an impressive array of ribbons and decorations that spoke to a distinguished career.
Davidson and Roberts immediately stood at attention.
As you were, the Admiral said quietly.
I'm Admiral Harrison. I understand there's a situation here involving claims of SEAL service.
Yes, sir, Davidson said. This woman has been claiming to be a former SEAL, but her story doesn't check out. Admiral Harrison nodded and looked directly at Sarah. There was something in his expression that she couldn't quite read, not anger or suspicion like the others, but a kind of careful assessment. Ma'am, could you stand up and extend your left arm? He asked. Sarah looked confused but complied, standing and extending her arm as requested.
Could you pull back your sleeve? Sarah's heart began racing.
She knew what he was looking for, the tattoo that Roberts had mentioned earlier. With trembling fingers, she pushed back the sleeve of her hoodie, revealing the small tattoo on her inner wrist.
Admiral Harrison stepped closer and examined the tattoo carefully.
It was a simple design, a trident surrounded by 13 stars, but Sarah could see recognition dawning in the Admiral's eyes.
The room fell silent as Admiral Harrison studied the tattoo.
Davidson and Roberts watched with curiosity, clearly not understanding the significance of what they were seeing. Marcus looked confused and frustrated, still trying to process the revelations about Sarah's deception.
Where did you get this tattoo? Admiral Harrison asked quietly. Sarah's mouth went dry.
The tattoo marked her as a member of a unit that officially didn't exist. It had been done by a Navy corpsman in a forward operating base in Syria, part of an informal tradition among the members of her classified unit. Getting the tattoo had been her choice, but keeping its meaning secret was not optional. I can't discuss that, sir, she said.
Admiral Harrison nodded slowly. When did you get it?
2018, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper.
Where?
Sarah closed her eyes. Even naming the location could be revealing classified information about operations that had never been officially acknowledged.
I can't say, sir. Admiral Harrison was quiet for a long moment, studying both the tattoo and Sarah's face. Then, he turned to the other men in the room.
Gentlemen, I need to speak with Ms. Martinez privately.
Could you please step outside? Davidson looked uncertain.
Sir, we were in the middle of investigating potential stolen valor claims.
I understand. But I need a few minutes alone with her.
Something in the Admiral's tone made it clear that this wasn't a request.
Davidson and Roberts exchanged glances, then headed for the door.
Marcus lingered for a moment, looking hurt and confused.
Marcus, Sarah said softly, I'm sorry.
I know you don't understand, and I can't explain it properly, but I'm sorry.
Marcus shook his head and left without responding, leaving Sarah alone with Admiral Harrison.
The Admiral waited until the door closed, then sat down across from her. His demeanor had changed subtly, he was still authoritative, but there was less formal military bearing and more genuine concern. Sarah Martinez, he said thoughtfully.
Petty Officer First Class, discharged in 2022.
Yes, sir.
I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to answer honestly. Can you do that? Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure how honest she could be without revealing classified information. Did you ever serve at Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti? Sarah's eyes widened. Camp Lemonnier was where her unit had been based for several months in 2019 during a classified operation.
Very few people would know to ask about that specific location in connection with her service. Yes, sir, she said carefully.
Were you part of Operation Sandstorm?
Sarah's heart nearly stopped. Operation Sandstorm was the code name for one of the most classified missions she had participated in.
It wasn't even supposed to have a name that could be spoken aloud.
"Sir, I can't."
"It's okay," Admiral Harrison said gently. "I know you can't discuss operational details.
But, you can confirm or deny whether you were there." Sarah looked at him carefully, trying to understand how he could possibly know about Operation Sandstorm. His uniform displayed ribbons that suggested extensive experience with special operations, but that didn't necessarily mean he would have knowledge of her specific unit's activities.
"Yes, sir," she said finally. "I was part of that operation." Admiral Harrison nodded.
"Tell me about Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez."
The name hit Sarah like a punch to the gut.
Rodriguez had been the senior NCO assigned to liaise with her unit during several operations. He had been killed in Somalia in 2020, and his death had been one of the hardest losses Sarah had experienced during her military service. "He was killed in Mogadishu," she said, her voice tight with emotion.
"IED during an extraction operation. How do you know that?" Sarah looked at him steadily.
"Because I planned the route he was traveling when he died."
Admiral Harrison was quiet for a moment, processing her response.
Sarah could see him putting together pieces of information, connecting dots that very few people would have access to. "The tattoo," he said finally. 13 stars surrounding a trident.
"It's not a SEAL tattoo." "No, sir, it's not. It's from Naval Special Warfare Development Group Task Force Echo."
Sarah felt her world shift. Task Force Echo was the official designation for her unit, but it was so highly classified that even most Navy personnel didn't know it existed. The fact that Admiral Harrison not only knew about it but could identify its unofficial tattoo meant he had knowledge that very few people possessed.
"Sir, I can't confirm or deny."
"You don't need to," Admiral Harrison said. "I know because I was the one who approved the creation of Task Force Echo in 2014. Sarah stared at him in shock. If what he was saying was true, then Admiral Harrison wasn't just familiar with her unit, he was one of the senior officers responsible for its existence. "You were part of a unit that officially doesn't exist," he continued. "Your service record was sanitized for operational security reasons. The missions you participated in are still classified at levels that may never be declassified.
And the work you did saved more lives than most people will ever know." Tears began flowing down Sarah's cheeks.
For 3 years since her discharge, she had felt like her military service had been erased, like the sacrifices she had made and the contributions she had offered didn't matter because they couldn't be officially acknowledged.
"The men outside don't understand," Admiral Harrison said gently.
"They see someone claiming SEAL service without the proper credentials, and they think stolen valor. They don't know that you were embedded with SEAL teams on operations that were more dangerous and more important than most of the missions those teams conducted."
"But I did lie," Sarah said.
"I told them I was a SEAL when I wasn't."
"You told them that because you couldn't tell them the truth," Admiral Harrison replied.
"Your actual service is classified at a level that makes discussing it a federal crime. So when people ask about your military experience, you're left with the choice of lying or remaining completely silent about some of the most important work the Navy has ever done."
Sarah had never thought about it that way.
She had been so focused on her guilt about lying that she hadn't considered the impossible position that classification had put her in.
"The PTSD you're dealing with," Admiral Harrison continued, "is that from your actual service?"
"Yes, sir."
"Operation Sandstorm specifically?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "I read the after-action reports from that operation. What you went through would have broken most people."
"The fact that you're here, trying to build a normal life, is remarkable."
For the first time in years, Sarah felt like someone understood what she had been through.
Admiral Harrison wasn't just acknowledging her service, he was validating experiences that she had begun to think might have been forgotten by everyone except herself.
"What do I do now?" she asked. "Those men think I'm a fraud. My friends think I'm a liar. How do I explain any of this without revealing classified information?" Admiral Harrison was quiet for a moment, considering her question.
"Let me handle the immediate situation," he said finally.
"I can confirm that your military service was exemplary without revealing operational details. As for your friends in the veterans group, that's more complicated.
They'll never trust me again."
"Maybe not all of them.
But the ones who matter will understand that military service comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most important service is the kind that can never be publicly acknowledged.
Admiral Harrison stood up and moved toward the door. Stay here for a few more minutes. I'm going to speak with the others.
As he reached for the door handle, he paused and turned back to her.
Sarah, what you did over there mattered. The fact that it's classified doesn't make it any less real or any less important. Don't let anyone make you feel ashamed of service that kept Americans safe.
After he left, Sarah sat alone in the conference room, trying to process everything that had just happened. For the first time since her discharge, someone with actual knowledge of her service had acknowledged what she had been through. Someone understood why she struggled with civilian life, why loud noises made her jump, why she had nightmares about missions that officially never happened. But, even as relief washed over her, she knew that the hardest part was still ahead. She would have to face Marcus and the other veterans, knowing that some of them would never believe her story. She would have to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by her deception. And she would have to find a way to live with the knowledge that the most important chapters of her life could never be fully shared with the people who mattered most to her. The sound of voices in the hallway told her that Admiral Harrison was speaking with Davidson and Roberts. She couldn't make out the specific words, but the tone suggested a serious conversation that would likely change how they viewed her situation. Sarah looked down at the tattoo on her wrist, a mark that had caused so much trouble but also led to her vindication. 13 stars surrounding a trident, each star representing a mission that had pushed her to her limits, a trident symbolizing her connection to the naval special warfare community even though she had never worn the official insignia. She thought about the men and women she had served with, the operators who had depended on her intelligence analysis and technical expertise to keep them alive in hostile territory. She thought about the lives that had been saved by operations she had helped plan and execute. She thought about the classified commendations that sat in a vault somewhere, recognition for service that could never be publicly acknowledged. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah felt proud of her military service instead of just guilty about how she had misrepresented it. The conversation in the hallway had gone on for nearly 20 minutes when Admiral Harrison finally returned to the conference room. His expression was serious but not unkind, and Sarah could tell that whatever discussion had taken place had been thorough. "How are you holding up?" he asked, taking his seat across from her again.
"Honestly? I'm not sure," Sarah replied. "This whole situation feels surreal." Admiral Harrison nodded. "I can imagine.
Let me tell you what I discussed with Senior Chief Davidson and Petty Officer Roberts." He leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "I confirmed that you served with distinction in classified naval special warfare operations. I told them that your service record was sanitized for operational security reasons, and that questioning you further about specific missions or unit assignments would be inappropriate."
What was their reaction? Confused at first, then understanding.
Davidson has enough experience with classified operations to know that sometimes the most important service is the kind that never gets official recognition. Roberts took a little more convincing, but he came around. Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders, but she knew the hardest conversation was still ahead.
"What about Marcus and the others?"
"That's more complicated," Admiral Harrison admitted. "Military personnel understand classification and operational security. Civilian veterans may have a harder time accepting that you couldn't discuss your real service."
As if summoned by their conversation, there was a knock on the door.
Marcus entered, followed by Davidson and Roberts. The atmosphere in the room had changed significantly from the hostile interrogations Sarah had faced earlier.
Davidson approached first. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. Admiral Harrison has explained that your service involved classified operations that you can't discuss."
"I should have considered that possibility before jumping to conclusions about stolen valor."
Roberts nodded, though he looked less comfortable than his colleague. "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry for assuming the worst." Marcus stood back, his expression unreadable. Sarah could see the hurt and confusion still written across his face. "Marcus," she said softly, "I know this is hard to understand." "Try me," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "Because right now I feel like I don't know you at all." Admiral Harrison cleared his throat. "Mr. Thompson, may I explain what I can?"
Marcus nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on Sarah.
"Ms.
Martinez served in a highly classified unit that provided critical support to Special Operations Forces," Admiral Harrison began. Her work saved American lives and advanced national security objectives in ways that may never be publicly acknowledged. The nature of her service required her actual assignments and accomplishments to be classified at levels that make discussing them a federal crime. Marcus listened carefully, but Sarah could see the skepticism in his eyes. So when she told me she was a SEAL, that was, what exactly? That was her trying to find a way to connect with fellow veterans without revealing classified information, Admiral Harrison replied. It was poor judgment, but it came from a desire to share the camaraderie that military service creates, not from a desire to claim credit she hadn't earned. Sarah appreciated the Admiral's attempt to explain her actions, but she knew she had to speak for herself. Marcus, I made a terrible mistake, she said. When you asked about my service, I should have just said I couldn't discuss it. But I was so desperate to feel like I belonged somewhere that I said the first thing I thought would make you understand that I had experienced combat, that I knew what it was like to serve in dangerous situations. But why SEALs specifically? Sarah closed her eyes, remembering that moment weeks ago when the lie had first escaped her lips. Because I did work with SEAL teams. I was embedded with them on multiple deployments. I watched them train, I lived in the same bases, I went on missions with them. In some ways, I felt closer to them than to anyone else in the Navy because we shared experiences that I couldn't discuss with regular Navy personnel. She paused, struggling to find the right words. When I said I was a SEAL, part of me felt like it was true, even though I knew it wasn't. I had earned their respect, I had proved myself under fire alongside them, I carried the same psychological wounds they did. But, you're right to be angry. I claimed an identity that wasn't mine, and that was wrong. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing her explanation. The PTSD, he said finally. That's real? Yes, Sarah said without hesitation. Every bit of it. From these classified missions? Yes. Marcus looked at Admiral Harrison. Can you confirm that? I can confirm that Ms. Martinez participated in operations that would have been traumatic for anyone involved, Admiral Harrison said carefully. Her psychological wounds are absolutely legitimate. Davidson stepped forward. Ma'am, for what it's worth, I've seen a lot of sailors over the years, and your bearing and responses during our conversation showed someone who had definitely seen combat. I should have picked up on that instead of focusing solely on the SEAL question. Roberts nodded agreement. The way you reacted to certain questions, the way you held yourself, that's not something you can fake. You've been in harm's way. Sarah felt a mix of gratitude and sadness. It was validating to have her actual service recognized, but it came at the cost of revealing how desperate she had been for that recognition. What happens now? She asked. Admiral Harrison considered the question. From an official standpoint, nothing. You haven't committed any crimes. Stolen valor laws apply to people who use false claims of military service for financial gain or other tangible benefits. You were participating in a support group and trying to connect with fellow veterans. But people are talking, Marcus said. Word has gotten around the event about the whole situation. That's the harder problem to solve, Admiral Harrison acknowledged. But I think we can address it. He stood up and moved toward the door. Would you all be willing to come back to the main event? I'd like to address this situation publicly. Sarah's heart began racing again. Sir, I don't think that's a good idea. Making this more public will just make things worse. Trust me, Admiral Harrison said gently. Sometimes the best way to handle a misunderstanding is with transparency. 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself standing at the front of the convention center's main hall. Admiral Harrison had asked the event organizers to gather everyone's attention for a brief announcement. Sarah felt exposed and vulnerable standing before the crowd, many of whom she knew had heard rumors about the confrontation earlier. Admiral Harrison stepped up to the microphone that had been set up for the event's earlier presentations. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Admiral Harrison, and I wanted to address some confusion that has arisen this evening regarding one of our veterans. The hall fell quiet, with hundreds of eyes turning toward the front of the room. Military service takes many forms, Admiral Harrison continued. Some of our service members serve in roles that receive public recognition and honor. Others serve in capacities that must remain classified for national security reasons. Both types of service are equally valid and equally deserving of our respect. Sarah could see people in the crowd exchanging glances, trying to understand where the Admiral was heading with his remarks. Ms. Sarah Martinez served our nation with distinction in classified naval operations, Admiral Harrison said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. The nature of her service prevents her from discussing many details of her military experience. When she attempted to share her background with fellow veterans, she made the mistake of using terminology that didn't precisely describe her role. He paused, looking out over the assembled crowd. This was not stolen valor. This was a veteran trying to connect with her peers while navigating the complex challenges of discussing classified service. Ms. Martinez's contributions to our national security were significant and came at great personal cost. She deserves our support, not our suspicion. The hall remained quiet as Admiral Harrison's words sank in. Sarah could see some people nodding in understanding, while others still looked skeptical. Marcus stepped forward and took the microphone. "I want to say something," he began, his voice slightly uncertain. "I've been getting to know Sarah over the past few months through our Veterans Support Group. I've watched her struggle with PTSD, I've seen her night terrors, I've witnessed the very real psychological wounds she carries from her military service." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "When I learned that she had misrepresented some details of her service, I felt betrayed and angry. But, after hearing the fuller story, I understand that she was caught in an impossible situation, trying to connect with fellow veterans while being legally prohibited from discussing her actual service." Marcus turned to look at Sarah directly. "Sarah, I'm sorry for doubting you. Your service was real, your sacrifices were real, and your struggles are real. The specific details of how you served don't change any of that." A murmur went through the crowd as people began to understand the complexity of the situation. Sarah felt tears starting to form in her eyes as she saw several veterans in the audience nodding their approval of Marcus's statement. An older man near the front of the crowd raised his hand. Admiral Harrison nodded for him to speak. "I'm a Vietnam veteran," the man said. "I did 2 tours with Air Force Special Operations, and a lot of what we did over there is still classified 50 years later. I understand what it's like to not be able to talk about your service. This young lady has my support." A woman in the middle of the crowd spoke up next. "I served in military intelligence during the Gulf War. I can't discuss most of my assignments even now. We need to stop treating classification like it's something to be suspicious of." More voices joined in, and Sarah realized that many of the veterans in the room had dealt with similar challenges related to classified service. What had seemed like an isolating experience was actually more common than she had realized. Admiral Harrison retook the microphone. "Ms. Martinez, would you like to say anything?" Sarah approached the microphone with trembling hands. Looking out over the sea of faces, she saw expressions of understanding, sympathy, and support where she had expected judgment and condemnation. "I want to apologize," she began, her voice quiet but clear. "I made a mistake when I claimed to be something I wasn't. I was struggling with feeling like my service didn't matter because I couldn't talk about it, and I said things that weren't true in an attempt to feel like I belonged." She paused, gathering her courage to continue. "My actual service was different from what I claimed, but it was real. The missions I can't discuss, the teammates I lost, the nightmares I still have, all of that is real. I'm proud of what I did for my country, even if I can never share the details." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "To the veterans who welcomed me into your community, I'm sorry for misleading you. To the active duty personnel who rightfully questioned my claims, thank you for protecting the integrity of military service. And, to everyone dealing with the challenges of classified service, please know that you're not alone." The applause that followed was unexpected and overwhelming. Sarah had anticipated rejection and humiliation, but instead found acceptance and understanding from a community she had thought she had lost. As the formal part of the evening concluded, Sarah found herself surrounded by veterans wanting to share their own experiences with classified service or simply to offer their support. The conversation had shifted from accusation and defense to shared understanding of the unique challenges faced by military personnel whose service couldn't be fully acknowledged. Marcus approached as the crowd began to thin. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I should have trusted our friendship enough to believe there was more to your story." "You don't owe me anything," Sarah replied. "I lied to you. You had every right to feel betrayed. But, you lied because you were trying to protect classified information while still connecting with people who would understand your experiences," Marcus said. "That's not the same as lying for personal gain." Sarah smiled for the first time in days. "Thank you for understanding.
So what happens now? Marcus asked. Are you going to keep coming to the group meetings? Sarah had been wondering the same thing.
The veteran support group had become an important part of her recovery, but she wasn't sure how to navigate the relationships now that the truth had come out.
I'd like to, she said. If people are comfortable with me being there. I think most people will be, Marcus said.
Tonight showed that a lot of us have dealt with similar issues around classification and not being able to discuss our service.
You're not as alone as you thought you were. Admiral Harrison approached as Marcus headed back to join other members of their group.
How are you feeling? He asked.
Better than I expected, Sarah admitted. I thought this would be the end of everything, but it feels more like a new beginning.
Sometimes the truth is more powerful than we give it credit for, Admiral Harrison said.
Even when we can only tell part of it.
He handed her a business card.
I want you to have this.
It's got contact information for a support group specifically for veterans dealing with classified service issues. They meet monthly in DC, but they also have video conferences for people who can't travel. Sarah looked at the card, feeling a sense of relief that such resources existed. There are more of us than you might think, Admiral Harrison continued. People who served in units that don't officially exist, who participated in operations that are still classified decades later, who carry psychological wounds from missions that never happened according to public records.
Why hasn't anyone told me about this before? Because it's not widely advertised, Admiral Harrison explained.
Operational security concerns make it difficult to publicize resources for classified service veterans.
But the need is real, and there are people working to address it. As Admiral Harrison prepared to leave, Sarah had one more question.
Sir, how did you know?
About my unit, about Operation Sandstorm, about the tattoo? Admiral Harrison smiled slightly. Because I've been where you are.
Before I became an admiral, I spent several years in assignments that officially never existed.
I know what it's like to feel like your service doesn't count because you can't talk about it.
He paused, looking thoughtful.
That's why I've made it a priority to support veterans dealing with these issues. No one should have to choose between honoring their oath of secrecy and feeling like their service mattered.
As Admiral Harrison walked away, Sarah stood alone for a moment in the gradually emptying convention center. The evening had begun as her worst nightmare, public exposure and humiliation for her deception. But it had ended with validation, understanding, and connections to resources she hadn't known existed. For the first time since her discharge from the Navy, Sarah felt like she had a path forward that didn't require her to choose between protecting classified information and feeling like her service had meaning. She had a community of people who understood her experiences, resources to help her continue healing, and the knowledge that her actual service, even though it remained classified, had been recognized by someone who understood its importance. The guilt about her deception remained, but it was no longer overwhelming. She had learned that the shame she felt about not being able to discuss her service was shared by many others, and that finding healthy ways to connect with fellow veterans while respecting classification requirements was possible. As she walked toward the parking lot to drive home, Sarah rolled up her sleeve and looked at the small tattoo on her wrist. For 3 years, it had been a reminder of experiences she couldn't share. Tonight, it had become the key to recognition and understanding she had thought would never come. 13 stars surrounding a trident, symbols of missions completed, lives saved, and service that would forever remain in the shadows but had finally been acknowledged by someone who mattered. 6 months after the incident at the convention center, Sarah's life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. The classified service veteran support group that Admiral Harrison had connected her with had become a lifeline, providing her with a community of people who truly understood the unique challenges she faced. The group met monthly in Washington, D.C., and Sarah made the 4-hour drive from her home in Virginia every time. The first meeting had been intimidating, walking into a nondescript government building and being escorted to a secure conference room where a dozen other veterans sat around a table, each carrying their own burden of unacknowledged service. Dr. Patricia Williams, a retired Air Force colonel who facilitated the group, had introduced Sarah to the others without requiring her to share details about her classified assignments. The group operated under strict protocols that protected everyone's operational security while still allowing for meaningful discussion of the psychological challenges they all faced. The hardest part, shared Tom, a former CIA operative, during Sarah's third meeting, is feeling like your service didn't matter because you can't talk about it. My family thinks I spent 20 years behind a desk doing paperwork. Sarah had nodded, recognizing the isolation that came with being unable to share the experiences that had shaped her most profoundly. But she had also begun to understand that this isolation was not permanent or insurmountable. The group had taught her strategies for discussing her military experience without revealing classified information. They had helped her develop language for describing her PTSD symptoms to civilian therapists without mentioning specific operations. Most importantly, they had shown her that her service had value even if it could never be publicly recognized. Meanwhile, her relationship with the original veterans support group had evolved in unexpected ways. Marcus had become one of her strongest advocates, helping to explain her situation to newer members and defending her when occasional questions arose about her background. "Sarah's taught me something important," Marcus had told the group during a particularly meaningful session. "Military service isn't just about the battles you can talk about. Some of the most important contributions happen in the shadows, and those veterans deserve our support too." The group had rallied around Sarah in ways that surprised her. They had learned about the challenges faced by veterans of classified operations, and several members had become advocates for better support resources for this often overlooked population. Jennifer, a Marine veteran who had lost her leg in Iraq, had started a non-profit organization focused on supporting veterans whose service couldn't be fully acknowledged. "We need to make sure no veteran feels like their sacrifice doesn't count just because it's classified," she had explained when announcing the initiative. Sarah had been invited to serve on the organization's advisory board, a role that allowed her to help other veterans navigate similar challenges without requiring her to reveal details about her own service. The work was fulfilling in a way that surprised her. For years, Sarah had struggled with the feeling that leaving the military meant leaving behind the sense of purpose and mission that had defined her identity. But helping other veterans find their way through the maze of classification restrictions and public misunderstanding gave her a new sense of mission. One evening, as Sarah was preparing to leave after a particularly productive board meeting, she received a call from Admiral Harrison. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind me calling. I have a proposition for you." "Of course, sir. What can I do for you?" "The Navy is developing new programs to support veterans of classified operations," Admiral Harrison explained. "We're looking for someone to help design and implement these programs, someone who understands both the operational side and the veteran transition challenges." Sarah's heart began racing. What kind of position? It would be a civilian contractor role with the Pentagon. You'd be working on policy development, resource creation, and program implementation. The work would involve some travel to military bases to conduct training and outreach. The opportunity was more than Sarah had dared to hope for. It would allow her to use her experience to help other veterans while giving her a sense of purpose and mission that had been missing from her civilian life. "Sir, I'm very interested, but I have to ask, how would this work given my history with the Stolen Valor incident?" Admiral Harrison chuckled slightly. "Sarah, that incident is exactly why you're qualified for this position. You understand the impossible position that classification puts veterans in. You've experienced firsthand how the system fails to support people who served in classified roles. That experience makes you uniquely qualified to help fix the problem." 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself back in Washington, D.C., this time walking into the Pentagon for her first day as a contractor with the Navy's Personnel Support Division. Her office was small and windowless, but it represented something she had thought was lost forever: the opportunity to serve her country again. Her first project involved developing guidelines for military personnel transitioning from classified assignments to civilian life. She drew on her own experiences and those of the veterans she had worked with to create materials that addressed the practical and psychological challenges of reintegration. The work required her to interview dozens of veterans who had served in classified roles across different branches of the military. Each conversation reinforced her understanding that she was far from alone in her struggles. "I haven't been able to tell my wife what I actually did for 20 years, confided a retired Army intelligence specialist. "She thinks I was a desk jockey. I can't explain why I have nightmares about missions that officially never happened. My kids ask me about my military service, and I have to give them these vague answers that make it sound like I never did anything important," shared a former Navy cryptologist. How do you tell your children you're proud of work you can't describe? These stories became the foundation for the programs Sarah developed. Working with Dr. Williams and other experts, she created training curricula for mental health professionals who worked with veterans of classified operations. She developed support group models that could be implemented at military bases and veteran centers. She wrote policy recommendations for improving the transition process for personnel leaving classified assignments. The work was challenging but deeply rewarding. Sarah found herself becoming a recognized expert in an area that had been largely overlooked by the military establishment. Her recommendations were being implemented at bases around the world, and she received regular reports about their positive impact. 1 year after starting her new position, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Marcus had driven down to D.C. and asked if he could take her to lunch. "I have something to tell you," he said as they sat in a small restaurant near the Pentagon. "I've been thinking about what you went through, about how the system failed to support you when you transitioned out of the military." Sarah nodded, curious about where he was heading. "I've decided to go back to school," Marcus continued. "I'm getting a master's degree in counseling psychology, with a focus on military veterans. I want to specialize in working with people who have served in classified roles." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. "Marcus, that's incredible. You inspired me," he said simply. "Watching you turn your struggles into something that helps other people, that showed me what real service looks like." They talked for 2 hours about Marcus's plans, about Sarah's work, and about the growing recognition that veterans of classified operations needed specialized support. What had begun as a crisis that nearly destroyed Sarah's sense of identity had become the foundation for meaningful change that would help thousands of other veterans. As they prepared to leave, Marcus had one more surprise. "There's something else. The Veteran Support Group back home, we've decided to start a special monthly meeting for veterans dealing with classification issues. We're calling it the Silent Service Support Group." Sarah laughed at the name. "That's perfect. We'd like you to be our consulting advisor. You could participate virtually when you can't travel back, and maybe visit in person when your schedule allows." The invitation meant more to Sarah than Marcus could have known. It represented full acceptance from the community she had thought she had lost through her deception. That evening, Sarah stood on her apartment balcony overlooking the Potomac River, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. 2 years earlier, she had been consumed by guilt and shame, feeling like her military service had been meaningless because it couldn't be acknowledged. The tattoo on her wrist had once felt like a burden, a reminder of experiences she could never share. Now it felt like a badge of honor, representing not just her own service but the service of thousands of other men and women whose contributions remained in the shadows. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Williams. "Sarah, I just wanted to let you know that the program you developed has been approved for implementation at all major military installations. Congratulations on changing how the military supports classified service veterans." Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment and purpose that had been missing from her life for too long. The work was far from over. There were still thousands of veterans struggling with issues related to classified service, still policies that needed to be changed, still systems that needed to be improved. But, for the first time since leaving the military, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing work that mattered, making a difference in the lives of people who had made significant sacrifices for their country. 3 months later, Sarah received an invitation that brought everything full circle. The annual military appreciation event where her ordeal had begun was being held again, and this time she had been asked to be one of the featured speakers. Standing at the podium in the same convention center where she had faced accusations of stolen valor, Sarah looked out over a crowd that included many familiar faces: Marcus and members of their veterans group, Admiral Harrison, Senior Chief Davidson, and dozens of veterans she had worked with through her various programs. 2 years ago, I stood in this same room facing accusations that I had falsely claimed military service, she began, her voice clear and confident. Those accusations were based on a misunderstanding about the nature of classified military service and the challenges faced by veterans who can't discuss their actual assignments. She paused, making eye contact with people throughout the audience. Tonight, I want to talk about the thousands of veterans who have served our country in roles that must remain classified. These men and women have made extraordinary sacrifices, faced incredible dangers, and contributed to our national security in ways that may never be publicly acknowledged. Sarah spent the next 20 minutes outlining the programs that had been developed to support classified service veterans, the policy changes that had been implemented, and the growing recognition of this population's unique needs. Service to our country takes many forms, she concluded. Some service happens in the spotlight, with medals and recognition and parades. Other service happens in the shadows, with only the knowledge that the mission was accomplished and lives were saved. Both types of service are equally valid, equally important, and equally deserving of our support and respect. The standing ovation that followed was longer and more enthusiastic than Sarah had expected. But more meaningful than the applause were the individual conversations that followed, veterans thanking her for giving voice to their experiences, family members expressing gratitude for helping them understand their loved ones' struggles, and military officials committing to further expand the programs she had helped develop. As the evening wound down, Admiral Harrison approached her one final time. "Sarah, I have one more opportunity to discuss with you. The Joint Chiefs are establishing a new position, Director of Classified Service Veteran Affairs. It's a senior civilian position that would coordinate support programs across all branches of the military." Sarah's eyes widened. It was a position that would allow her to have an even greater impact on the issues she cared about most. "They want to offer you the position," Admiral Harrison continued. "Your experience, both personal and professional, makes you uniquely qualified to lead this effort." Standing in the same place where her world had nearly fallen apart 2 years earlier, Sarah felt overwhelmed by the opportunity to serve her country in a new capacity, to ensure that future veterans would never face the isolation and confusion she had experienced. "Sir," she said with a smile that reflected both confidence and humility, "I would be honored to accept." As she drove home that night, Sarah reflected on the unexpected path that had brought her to this moment. What had begun as a lie born of desperation had ultimately led to truth, recognition, and a new form of service that might help thousands of other veterans. The tattoo on her wrist caught her eye as she gripped the steering wheel, 13 stars surrounding a trident, symbols of classified missions and hidden service that had finally found their place in the light. Sometimes, Sarah realized, the most important journeys begin with our biggest mistakes, and the greatest service comes from transforming our struggles into strength for others. Her story had become proof that redemption was possible, that classified service could be honored without being revealed, and that even the deepest shame could be transformed into meaningful purpose. The road ahead would bring new challenges, implementing programs on a national scale, working with congressional oversight committees, building partnerships with veteran service organizations. But, for the first time in years, Sarah felt ready for whatever came next. She was no longer running from her past or hiding from her service. She was building a future where no veteran would have to choose between protecting classified information and feeling like their sacrifice mattered. And that, she knew, was a mission worthy of everything she had learned from both her failures and her redemption.